There are wildfires, and then there are infernos, living, breathing monsters that strip the world of all sound except the rush of flames and the scream of the wind. Northern Colorado hadn't seen rain for weeks, and what started as a careless spark on a hiker's cigarette turned into a blaze that leapt canyon to canyon, feasting on brittle sage and dry grass, painting the sky the color of old blood. Riley Carson could smell the smoke long before she reached the ridge. Her hands remembered the feel of the old fire engine's cracked steering wheel, though it was years since she'd driven one. Now, she was supposed to be just another volunteer at Windsong Sanctuary, a place meant for healing, not heroics. But as the urgent call came in from her old crew, Riley's body moved before her mind could argue. Someone needed to evacuate the horses stranded on a remote outcrop, the fire line moving too fast for the usual rescue teams. There wasn't time to debate. There never was when fire was involved. The ride up the ridge was a blur of sirens, static-filled radio voices, and the grim faces of former colleagues. Their gear didn't fit quite right anymore. Everything was borrowed, nothing hers. Ash coated the windshield, and somewhere in the distance, a barn exploded, sending embers skyward. Horses screamed, a sound so raw and human it punched straight through Riley's chest. She felt her own pulse pounding with the memory of every evacuation she'd ever botched, every animal she hadn't saved. "Carson!" her old captain barked, shoving a battered helmet into her hands. "You got 2 minutes. Anything left up there? Bring 'em down or get clear. This fire's not playing." Riley nodded, her throat tight. She grabbed a halter, a rope, a bucket of grain, just in case. When she ran toward the smoke, the world narrowed to the crunch of gravel and the suffocating heat. Every instinct screamed at her to get out. But ahead, through the haze, she spotted movement, a dark figure just beyond a collapsed fence. Most of the herd was gone, already loaded into trailers or, heartbreakingly, vanished in the chaos. But there, in the heart of it, stood a single horse. Jet black, streaked with soot, her body rigid as a statue. The mare's nostrils flared, white blaze down her nose streaked with ash, eyes fixed on a small, scorched patch of earth. No matter how the smoke shifted, she didn't move, as if her hooves were welded to the ground by grief. Riley called out, her voice hoarse. "Hey, girl! Hey! We have to go, now!" The mare flicked an ear, but made no other sign she'd heard. Riley crept closer, keeping her movements slow, careful. She knew that look, the way an animal clings to a place because of something it lost there. In the dirt, Riley saw the unmistakable outline of a small body, a foal, its form burned into the blackened earth. The air shimmered with heat, but the chill that gripped Riley's spine was colder than anything she'd ever felt. The fire roared closer. Ash fell like filthy snow. Riley crouched low, talking softly, each word shaped more by breath than sound. She threw the rope aside. No tricks, no force, only presence. "I'm here," she whispered. "I see you." For a long moment it seemed hopeless. The mare's ribs shuddered, her body trembling between flight and collapse. A tree behind them exploded in a shower of sparks. The fire was nearly upon them now, the sound so loud it was hard to tell if the ground itself was screaming. Riley could feel the hairs on her arms singeing, the skin on her neck tightening with fear. Still, she stayed. Inch by inch, she slid closer. She remembered everything her old mentor had taught her. Not about fighting fire, but about trust. How sometimes the bravest thing you could do was stand your ground and wait. She didn't try to touch the mare. Instead, she knelt down in the dirt, close enough that the animal could feel her calm. She slowed her breathing, heartbeat by heartbeat. The mare snorted, the muscles in her neck flickering with panic, but she didn't bolt. Riley met her eyes, dark, wild, full of loss. I know what it's like to lose someone, Riley breathed. But we can't stay here, not tonight, please. For one agonizing second, nothing happened. Then, impossibly, the mare took a step forward. Just one. Riley didn't move, didn't celebrate. She let the silence stretch between them, thick as the smoke, sacred as a prayer. The mare blinked, shook her mane, and moved again. The first real movement she'd made since Riley arrived. She hesitated once more by the scorched patch of ground, lowering her head as if to say goodbye. Riley waited, honoring the moment, not rushing it. Behind them, the radio crackled with frantic voices. The crew was yelling for her to get out. "Now, Carson, you got 30 seconds. But time, for that instant, bent around the two of them, woman and horse, both unwilling to let go. Finally, with the fire's breath scorching her back, Riley rose slowly, keeping herself between the mare and the growing wall of flames. Step by step, they backed away together. When the mare faltered, Riley hummed softly, an old lullaby she barely remembered from childhood. The melody cut through the chaos, strange and out of place, but it seemed to work. The mare followed, her movements stiff but determined. They broke through the smoke just as the first line of hoses sprayed a useless arc of water at the advancing fire. Riley didn't look back. She didn't have to. The worst was behind them, for now. When they reached the waiting trailer, her hands shook so badly she dropped the halter twice before managing to secure it. The mare loaded without a fight, as if some silent understanding had passed between them. The crew didn't cheer. There was no time, but someone clapped Riley on the shoulder, hard enough to almost knock her over. "You're crazy," her captain muttered, half grinning through soot-blackened teeth. But I'll be damned if that wasn't something to see. By the time they made it back to Windsong Sanctuary, the news was already running headlines. Volunteer saves doomed horse in Colorado fire. Cameras waited by the gate, hungry for a sound bite. Riley ignored them. The trauma still throbbed under her ribs, too raw to share with strangers. All she could think of was the mare's eyes, that terrible, beautiful stubbornness, a kind of grief that refused to run. She would later call the mare Sable, after the darkness that almost swallowed them both. But for now, as dusk bled through the smoke, Riley sat by Sable's new pen and watched the sky. Somewhere in the blackened hills behind her, the fire still burned. But here in the hush of twilight, two survivors waited for something they couldn't name. A second chance, maybe. Or just a little peace. Windsong Sanctuary was supposed to be a place of healing, but for Sable it was only a new kind of silence. The first week after the fire, Sable hardly moved. The other horses, a gentle herd of rescues, old workhorses, skittish ponies, a few retired ranch stallions, kept their distance, as if they sensed something sacred and untouchable about the black mare with the white blaze. Sable spent most hours in the farthest corner of her pen, facing the fence line, head low, hooves unmoving. At times, she almost seemed to fade into the dusk, as if she was part of the shadows rather than something living. Riley watched her from the barn window each morning, coffee turning cold in her hands. She recognized that kind of grief. It was the same hollow ache she'd carried after her father died. The feeling that the world had gone on, but something vital inside her had simply stopped. Maybe that was why she couldn't leave Sable alone, even when the other volunteers whispered that the mare was a lost cause. Mornings at Windsong were usually filled with quiet, familiar routines. Buckets to fill, stalls to rake, soft greetings for each horse as they lined up for breakfast. Sable, though, wouldn't come. She ignored the feed, the fresh hay, even the gentle offers of an apple or carrot. When the sun climbed higher, she'd sometimes turn her head toward the east, her ears pricking, eyes searching the horizon as if waiting for something, someone that would never return. Riley started making a point to clean Sable's pen herself, even when she was supposed to be helping elsewhere. She spoke little, moving quietly, never crowding. Some horses needed touch or treats to open up, but not Sable. She needed space, honest, respectful, unhurried. Some evenings, after chores were done, Riley would simply sit a few feet away, reading softly from whatever book she had on hand, letting her voice fill the silence with something gentle and familiar. Other volunteers watched with a mix of sympathy and skepticism. "She'll never come around," Marcia, the head groom, said one afternoon, wiping sweat from her brow. "Some animals, they just stay broken." Riley nodded, but inside she bristled at the word. Broken. She'd seen enough people call themselves that too, after loss or trauma. But grief wasn't a fracture. It was a long, winding scar, always present, but not always visible. One night, a thunderstorm rolled in without warning. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending sheets of rain slamming into the barn roof. Riley was about to leave for her tiny rented room in town when she heard the frantic clatter of hooves. Rushing outside, she found Sable pacing her pen, head tossing, eyes wild with terror as thunder cracked overhead. The other horses were huddled under the eaves, but Sable crashed into the gate again and again, as if trying to escape something only she could see. Riley didn't hesitate. She grabbed her jacket, pulled up her hood, and climbed into Sable's pen. The mare shied away at first, snorting, hooves churning muddy puddles. Riley kept her movements slow and steady, her voice a low, steady murmur, barely audible over the rain. "Easy, girl. You're safe. I'm not going anywhere." She didn't try to touch Sable. Instead, she sat down cross-legged in the mud, pulling her book from her jacket pocket, an old paperback of Steinbeck, pages warped from too many rainy mornings. With the flashlight held steady, Riley began to read aloud, her voice trembling only slightly. Sable circled her, nervous but curious, ears flicking back and forth. When a particularly loud peal of thunder rolled across the valley, Sable froze, nostrils flared. Riley paused her reading and simply breathed, slow and deep, letting her calmness fill the air. The storm dragged on for hours. The power in the barn flickered, leaving the whole property shrouded in darkness except for the weak beam of Riley's flashlight. She kept reading, sometimes just humming when her throat grew hoarse, anything to keep the fear at bay. Eventually, Sable stopped pacing. She stood a few feet from Riley, sides heaving, but no longer running. As dawn began to break, painting the sky with tentative pink and gold, Sable dropped her head, took a tentative step forward, and for the first time since arriving, nibbled at the fresh hay Riley had scattered in her stall. Riley hardly dared to breathe. She didn't reach out, didn't offer praise. She let Sable eat in peace, tears stinging her eyes, not from sadness, but from a strange, fierce hope. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was something. The beginning of trust, born out of silence and storm. After that night, things changed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly. Sable didn't transform overnight into a sociable, easygoing mare, but she started to acknowledge Riley's presence. When Riley brought fresh water or mucked out the pen, Sable would sometimes flick an ear in her direction, watching with a wary but curious gaze. She still spent long hours standing motionless by the fence, but now, if Riley waited quietly enough, the mare would eventually drift closer. Word of the thunderstorm night traveled through the sanctuary, twisted and embellished. Some volunteers began to see Riley and Sable as a pair, two survivors drawn together by loss and stubbornness. But neither Riley nor Sable seemed to care about the gossip. Their bond was quiet, built not on dramatic gestures but on patience and respect. Some nights, when the moon was bright and the air sweet with hay, Riley would bring her folding chair and sit near the pen, reading softly or just humming old lullabies. She stopped trying to force progress. Instead, she simply offered her presence day after day. The volunteers marveled when Sable, on more than one occasion, stretched out in the straw, her body finally able to rest. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't a miracle. But as Riley logged Sable's progress in her notebook, she realized she wasn't just recording the mare's healing. She was tracking her own. In that pen, night after night, two beings waited together, neither rushing the other, each learning that some wounds could only heal in the quiet space between storm and sunrise. Spring in northern Colorado doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps in on uncertain feet. One day the ground is a muddy, frost-bitten mess. The next, patches of wildflowers poke bravely through the thaw. The landscape around Windsong Sanctuary, scarred by fire, slowly greened at the edges. Charred trees stood like silent sentinels above new grass, a strange testament to both destruction and resilience. For Riley and Sable, the world's slow return to life mirrored the way grief moved, never on anyone's schedule, always demanding patience. Riley fell into the rhythms of sanctuary work, her life measured in the small, careful steps of Sable's recovery. Mornings were always the same. Riley rose before the sun, the chill still sharp enough to sting her lungs as she crossed the dew-damp field. She'd find Sable already awake, standing near the east side of the pen, her head tilted slightly upward as the first rays broke over the mountains. It became a ritual between them, silent, shared. Riley recorded it in her notebook. Sable lifts her head for sunrise, like she's looking for hope. The other horses moved on from the trauma of the fire in their own ways, finding comfort in routine, grazing, or playing together in the pastures. Sable, though, kept to herself. The volunteers noticed that she always avoided the pond at the far end of the sanctuary's largest field. Riley, curious, began asking questions. Marcia, the head groom, was the first to speak quietly about what had happened during the chaos of the fire's first night. Her foal drowned there. In the panic, maybe trying to escape the flames. We tried, Riley. We really did. The knowledge hit Riley harder than she expected. She watched Sable even more closely now, understanding that the mare's scars weren't just burned patches on her skin. They were layers of sorrow that shaped every step she took. Grief was stubborn, Riley knew. You couldn't rush it or demand it leave. All you could do was make space for it to exist until, eventually, something gentler grew in its place. Riley made a habit of gentle grooming. She'd bring her softest brush and work slowly, always letting Sable decide how close she wanted her. At first, Sable would stand rigid, flinching at the lightest touch, but as the days warmed, she began to relax under Riley's careful hand. Scar tissue peeked through Sable's dark coat, mapping the places where fire had nearly claimed her. Riley whispered as she brushed, talking about nothing and everything. Stories from her childhood, snippets of songs, the secret names she'd given to each star overhead. Sable listened, her breathing slow and steady, her eyes never quite meeting Riley's, but never turning away either. Sometimes grief made Riley restless. She would sit in her little room at night, unable to sleep, the silence pressing on her chest. The old nightmares returned. Memories of her father's last days, the helplessness of hospital waiting rooms, the guilt of things unsaid. On those nights, she'd walk out under the stars, drawn to Sable's pen as if by some invisible tether. More often than not, she'd find Sable awake, standing watch over the fields, the two of them keeping company in the dark. One Sunday, Riley invited a group of children from the local foster program to the sanctuary, hoping fresh faces might bring new energy. The kids ran wild, laughing, chasing chickens, and trying to feed apples to the less timid horses. Riley watched Sable from a distance, worried the commotion would upset her. But instead, Sable stood at the fence, her posture wary but not afraid. One little girl, quiet and serious, asked Riley if she could brush Sable's mane. Riley hesitated, but handed her the brush, explaining how to move slowly, how to give Sable space. The mare didn't flinch. She stood perfectly still, accepting the child's gentle touch as if recognizing something kindred in the small, careful hands. Afterward, Riley wrote in her notebook, "Sometimes, the ones who've lost the most understand each other best." That became a kind of mantra for her. Healing, she realized, wasn't about pretending the pain never happened. It was about letting it transform you, about reaching out even when you still ached inside. The days rolled by, each one a lesson in patience. Sable gradually allowed more volunteers into her orbit. She started to respond to her name, the stiffness in her movements easing as her trust grew. Still, she avoided the pond, always cutting a wide arc around it during turnout. Riley didn't push her. She believed Sable would face it when she was ready, if ever. Some losses, after all, never truly healed. They just became part of you. As the season deepened, Riley found herself opening up too. She told Marcia about her dad, about the reason she'd left firefighting, about the guilt she'd carried ever since. The older woman listened without judgment, sometimes just squeezing Riley's shoulder or handing her a cup of coffee, warm and silent. The sanctuary became more than a workplace. It became a haven, a space where Riley could let her own grief breathe. One evening, Riley lingered in the barn after everyone else had gone home. The sky glowed lavender, a breeze rustling through the open doors. She watched Sable stand at the fence, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Riley pulled out her notebook and sketched the scene: mare, mountain, rising moon. She wondered if, given enough time, they could both find peace. Not the kind that erased what had happened, but the kind that made it possible to go on living. The season of stillness stretched out, gentle and unhurried. Every day, Riley and Sable met each other where they were without demands or expectations. In that quiet, something shifted, something small and vital, a trust built not in words or grand gestures, but in the simple act of waiting together for morning. The weeks bled into summer, and the sanctuary's daily rhythm settled around Riley like a familiar melody. She moved with purpose, hauling hay, checking fences, tracking the progress of each horse on her careful charts. She told herself she was content. Yet sometimes, when the sun dipped behind the mountains and the shadows grew long, she'd catch herself staring out at the horizon, a restless ache fluttering in her chest. Change was coming. She could feel it, as sure as the distant rumble of thunder before a storm. It started with an email, just a little red notification at the corner of her phone screen. But it knocked Riley off balance for the rest of the day. The subject line read, "Opportunity, U.S. Fire Management Position, Denver." Riley nearly deleted it without reading. She hadn't worn a uniform or carried a radio in years, not since the accident that ended her firefighting career and left her adrift, hunting for purpose in a world that felt too sharp and too empty. But curiosity, or maybe old habit, got the better of her. She read the job offer in her cramped room after chores, the barn smells still clinging to her clothes. The pay was good, the benefits were better. It was the kind of position that made people back home nod with approval, the kind that said you'd made it out of small-town obscurity. Riley thought about her mother's worried calls, the way her old friends spoke of real jobs, the constant reminder that she was just volunteering. For a few days, Riley tried to ignore the offer, but it lingered at the edges of her thoughts. She found herself weighing the pros and cons in the quiet moments, while brushing Sable's coat, stacking feed bags, jotting notes in her battered journal. The sanctuary was always short on funds. Marcia, the head groom, looked exhausted more often than not, and the board's whispers about sustainability grew louder with every meeting. Would it be selfish to leave, or foolish to stay? One evening, Riley lingered by Sable's pen as the last slant of sunlight gilded the mare's dark coat. Sable was calmer these days, greeting Riley with a soft snort, her ears flicking forward in quiet curiosity. The other horses gathered near the barn, but Sable seemed content to stand beside the gate, her breath steady, eyes reflecting the orange wash of sunset. Riley leaned against the fence, phone heavy in her pocket. She spoke softly, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess herself. "I got an offer, something big. Denver. Better money than this place can ever give. A chance to get back into what I used to do, fighting fires, leading teams. Real work, you know?" Her voice broke on the last word, the admission raw and unfamiliar. Sable listened, silent as always, her gaze never leaving Riley's face. For a while they just stood together in the hush. A breeze rustled the cottonwoods, carrying the faint scent of rain from the distant hills. Riley looked at Sable, at the mare's long, healed scars, at the softness in her dark eyes, and felt the pull of two worlds at war inside her. Part of her longed to run, to return to the adrenaline and certainty of her old life. But another part, the quieter, stubborn part, wanted to stay, to keep bearing witness to Sable's slow, honest recovery. That night, Riley packed a small box with the few things she couldn't replace. Her father's old compass, the first letter her mother ever sent to summer camp, a photo of her and her brother in the snow. She told herself she was only preparing. No decision had been made, but the act felt heavy, final. Each object placed in the box seemed to ask, "Are you leaving, or just trying to remember what home felt like?" As the hours crept by, Riley couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, her mind caught between hope and dread. Just before midnight, she wandered outside, drawn by a feeling she couldn't name. The moon hung low over the sanctuary, the world washed in silver light. Riley walked to Sable's pen, the cool grass damp beneath her feet. Sable stood by the gate waiting. She didn't whinny or stomp, just watched Riley approach with quiet expectation. Riley reached out, her hand trembling. "What should I do, girl?" she whispered, her words lost in the hush of night. "How do you know when it's time to move on, and when it's time to stay?" Sable stepped closer, her nose bumping gently against Riley's shoulder. The gesture was soft, deliberate, an answer without words. Riley felt the weight of the moment settle over her, a strange sense of clarity blooming in her chest. Maybe there were some choices that couldn't be made with logic or reason, only with presence, with loyalty to what mattered most. They stayed that way for a long time, side by side in the dark. Sable didn't try to leave. She didn't ask Riley to fix her grief, or promise that the pain would ever truly end. She just stood there, a silent companion, her warmth grounding Riley in the present. The next morning, Riley found herself looking at the sanctuary with new eyes. She saw the patched fences, the faded barn doors, the weary volunteers hauling buckets in the early light. But she also saw the small moments of joy, a colt kicking up its heels in fresh clover, an old mare basking in the sun, Marcia laughing at a stubborn goat's antics. The place was imperfect, uncertain, always teetering on the edge. But it was real. It was alive. Riley took out her phone, staring at the job offer one last time. She could hit accept. She could go back to Denver, reclaim her old life, find safety in routine and salary. Or she could stay, with all the risks and heartbreaks and small victories that life at the sanctuary offered. As she moved to feed Sable, the mare met her at the gate, eyes soft, body relaxed. Riley smiled, the decision settling inside her like a stone in a river. Sometimes, she realized, you don't need a reason to stay. You just need someone or something that asks you to. That evening, Riley put the box away. She unpacked her father's compass, set it on her windowsill, and let herself feel the unfamiliar sensation of hope. She didn't know what the future held, for herself, for Sable, for the sanctuary. But as the sun set and the horses nickered in their pens, Riley knew she wasn't alone. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. The news hit Riley like a punch in the gut. It was a Tuesday afternoon when she first heard the whispers in the tack room. Low voices, furtive glances, the way people talked when they didn't want to be overheard. She tried to ignore it at first, burying herself in chores. But by the time the evening meeting was called, dread had already set up camp in her stomach. Windsong Sanctuary had always walked a tightrope over disaster. Donations waxed and waned, and there were always more mouths to feed than checks in the mailbox. But this year felt worse. The fire had emptied emergency funds, and the fence repairs alone had cost more than Riley cared to think about. Still, she'd believed, maybe naively, that the board would always protect the horses first. That night shattered her faith. The board met in the cramped office at the back of the barn, the air thick with tension and the bitter scent of burnt coffee. Marcia sat near the door, arms folded, face drawn and weary. Across from her, 3 board members pored over a stack of spreadsheets, names and numbers, costs and liabilities. Riley sat in the corner, notebook on her knee, a knot of anxiety winding tighter in her chest. "We need to face reality," said Mr. Atwood, the chairman, a former banker who'd retired to the country for the quiet life. He tapped a red pen against the page. "We're in the red, folks. We either cut down the herd or risk losing the sanctuary altogether. Hard choices, but necessary ones." Riley tried to keep her voice steady. "What about a fundraiser? Another adoption event? I've already reached out to—" "We're out of time, Riley," interrupted Miss Foster, her tone sharp, businesslike. "And some of these animals, let's be honest, they're not adoptable. Sable, for example. She's barely social. She won't join the main herd. She's costing us a fortune in feed and vet bills. We can't afford to keep every lost cause." The words landed like blows. Riley clenched her fists, fighting the urge to lash out. She's not a lost cause. She's traumatized, but she's coming around. She just needs time. Marcia spoke up, her voice tired but fierce. "Riley's right. Sable's made progress. She trusts her and—" Atwood cut her off. "This isn't personal. If we don't sell, we risk everyone's future. Horses, staff, all of it. We have an offer from a private buyer willing to take a few of the unadoptables. Sable's on the list." Riley felt the room closing in. She looked at Marcia, who could only shrug helplessly, her eyes rimmed with worry. The other board members avoided Riley's gaze, their decision already made in the numbers. The vote was quick, a formality really. Riley and Marcia voted no. The others outvoted them, 3-2. Riley stood so fast her chair scraped the linoleum. "You're making a mistake. Sable's more than a liability. She's proof that healing is possible if we just—" "It's settled, Riley," Atwood said, gathering his papers. "The buyer will be here by week's end. If you want to say goodbye, do it soon." The meeting broke up in awkward silence, the board members shuffling out into the dusk, eyes averted. Marcia lingered, touching Riley's arm as she passed. "I'm sorry, hun. I tried." Riley stayed behind, anger and despair battling inside her. She paced the office, her mind racing. The idea of Sable, traumatized, barely trusting, sent off to an unknown future, was unbearable. She thought of the fire, the smoke, the way Sable had followed her out of the inferno because Riley had refused to give up. How could she abandon her now? She spent the night making calls, old contacts in the rescue world, local ranchers, even a desperate post on social media. But nobody had space for a scarred, withdrawn mare. Some promised to ask around, but their voices held little hope. As dawn crept in, Riley sat hunched at her kitchen table, head in her hands, exhaustion heavy on her bones. The next day, the buyer arrived, a man in a spotless white pickup with a gleaming horse trailer. He looked over Sable with a critical eye, asked a few questions Riley barely answered. Sable wouldn't let him near. She balked at the halter, ears pinned, feet planted stubbornly in the dirt. The buyer sighed, muttered about difficult animals, and turned to Riley. "You want a loader, or do I do it?" Riley felt her temper flare, her exhaustion burning off into raw determination. "Give me 1 week," she said, voice low and steady. The man arched an eyebrow, considering. "She's just not ready. 1 week, let me show you what she can do." He shrugged. "Fine, but if she's not on that trailer by then, I'm not coming back." As he drove away, Riley turned to Marcia, who'd watched the whole exchange from the paddock gate. "I'm not letting them take her. Not without a fight." Marcia nodded, squeezing Riley's shoulder. "I know. If anyone can reach her, it's you." That night, Riley walked the grounds in the hush after sunset, thinking. She looked at Sable, her silhouette framed by the last orange glow, standing watch by the fence, always searching the distance for something she'd lost. Riley promised herself then and there she wouldn't let the world teach Sable that trust was a mistake. Not now. Not ever. She pulled out her notebook, scribbling plans in the margins. New routines, different pastures, maybe even a journey. If the sanctuary wouldn't save Sable, Riley would find a way herself. As the stars rose, Riley stood beside Sable's pen, her hand resting on the mare's withers, both of them quiet in the night. 1 week, girl, she whispered. 1 week to change everything. The days after the board's decision moved both too quickly and not quickly enough. Riley felt each sunrise as a countdown, every tick of the clock pressing in on her shoulders. She kept replaying the meeting, Atwood's dismissive words, the way Sable's name was penciled onto a list as if she were just a number, not a life. 1 week, Riley told herself. 1 week to give this horse a chance at something better. She started at dawn, rousing herself before the first light bled through her curtains. Sable stood waiting at the fence as if she sensed the urgency in the air. Riley greeted her quietly, a ritual now, and slipped a halter gently over the mare's head. "Let's go see the world, girl. Just you and me." Sable's ears flicked back, but she didn't resist. It was as if she knew this was their chance. Riley led Sable past the barn and out toward the open fields beyond the sanctuary's familiar boundaries. She'd gotten permission, reluctant but given, to take Sable out on supervised walks during the week, hoping to prove the mare's potential to the skeptical buyer. But Riley had her own plan, deeper than anyone realized. She wanted to give Sable something she hadn't felt since the fire: the freedom to choose her own way forward. They crossed the rolling meadows, dew glistening on wild grasses, the world still hushed and blue with early morning. Riley didn't lead so much as walk beside Sable, letting the mare set her pace. Sometimes Sable would pause, nostrils flaring at an unfamiliar scent, or turn her head sharply at a distant call from the wind. When she hesitated, Riley simply waited. Trust, she'd learned, was never earned in a rush. They ventured further each day. Riley steered clear of the pond, out of respect for the silent pain that still haunted Sable's steps. Instead, they climbed gentle ridges, wandered through stands of cottonwood where yellow warblers flitted between branches. Riley spoke softly about her own story, about firefighting and her dad, and why she'd come to Windsong. Sable listened with that steady, unblinking gaze, the kind that made Riley feel both exposed and seen. By the third day, Riley noticed a change. Sable moved with a little more energy, her stride looser, the stiffness in her muscles eased by miles of open space. Once, when a jackrabbit burst from a clump of brush, Sable startled, but instead of freezing or bolting away, she actually took a hesitant step forward, ears pricked in curiosity. Riley felt a swell of hope, almost giddy in its suddenness. "That's it, girl. You're braver than you know." On the fourth morning, clouds gathered low and thick over the hills. The air hummed with the promise of rain. Riley packed extra grain and a small first aid kit, just in case. She wanted to take Sable to the ridgelines, high ground where, rumor had it, the wild horses still ran. The wind picked up as they climbed, tugging at Riley's jacket, sending Sable's mane streaming like a black banner. At the top, Riley paused, breathing hard, heart pounding, not from exertion, but from the view. The world stretched out in every direction, valleys silver with morning mist, the charred remains of the fire's path far below. Sable turned in a slow circle, ears swiveling as if she were searching for memories among the whispering grasses. Riley knelt beside her, hand resting gently on the mare's shoulder. Suddenly, Sable tensed. Riley followed her gaze. Something moved at the far edge of the clearing, hidden in the scrub. Before Riley could react, Sable whinnied, a low, mournful sound, full of longing and memory. Without warning, Sable broke into a trot, then a full canter, plunging down the slope and into the tangled brush. "Wait, Sable!" Riley shouted, heart racing. She scrambled after the mare, stumbling over rocks and roots, fear knotting in her throat. For a moment, she lost sight of Sable, panic threatening to overwhelm her. The old firefighter's instinct kicked in. Stay calm, scan the terrain, follow the signs. A snapped branch here, a hoofprint pressed deep into the mud there. Riley pushed on, breathless, following the path Sable had carved. The brush thinned, opening into a small, hidden valley, a secret hollow sheltered from the worst of the wind. There, in the high grass, Sable stood over a small chestnut colt. The foal was thin, ribs stark against its coat, and so still that for a terrible second, Riley thought it was dead. Sable lowered her head, nostrils flaring, breathing warmth onto the colt's trembling flank. Riley crept closer, heart pounding. The colt's eyes were wide and glazed, barely tracking movement. He was half-starved, legs wobbly, but when Sable nudged him with her nose, he made a faint, pitiful whicker. Sable stood protectively over the colt, a sentinel in the tall grass. Riley dropped to her knees, all exhaustion and frustration forgotten. She recognized the look in the colt's eyes. Shock, despair, a deep exhaustion that wanted only to surrender. Sable licked the colt's muzzle, and for the first time since her own foal's loss, let out a sound that was more gentle than sad, a soft nicker of reassurance. The colt didn't rise, but he blinked, eyes following Sable as she circled him, never leaving his side. It was getting late. The air was thick with the promise of rain, thunder rumbling on the horizon. Riley realized with a jolt that they couldn't stay out here overnight. She needed to make a decision. Risk carrying the colt, if he could be moved, or return for help and hope he'd still be alive by morning. Riley looked at Sable, at the unwavering care in her posture, the way she shielded the colt from the coming storm. This was what trust looked like, what healing could look like. Sable, who'd lost so much, who'd stood frozen by her grief, had chosen not to run from pain, but to comfort another creature in its own darkest hour. A plan began to form in Riley's mind. She would build a temporary shelter from her rain poncho and branches, gather water from the nearby stream, and keep watch through the night. She couldn't fix everything, but she could stay. Sometimes that was enough. As darkness crept into the hollow, Riley sat beside Sable and the colt, her arms wrapped around her knees. The rain began to fall, soft at first, then hard, drumming on the makeshift shelter. Sable stood guard, body curved protectively around the colt. Riley closed her eyes and listened to the storm, grateful for the small circle of warmth they'd created together. They were three survivors, each scarred in their own way, waiting for the dawn. Morning broke with a fragile hush. The night's rain had soaked the valley, leaving a silver mist drifting over the tall grass. Riley woke stiff and cold, curled awkwardly beneath her improvised shelter of poncho and broken branches. Her muscles ached from the hard ground, but the first thing she did was check on Sable and the colt. Sable was right where she'd been when Riley drifted off, standing sentinel over the chestnut colt, her head lowered, nose nearly touching his side. The colt hadn't moved much. He was still lying in the dew-wet grass, legs tucked under him, breathing shallow. Riley recognized the hollow look in his eyes, the way he didn't even flinch when a blue jay landed nearby, chattering in the willow thicket. She knelt beside them, feeling the chill seep into her bones. "Hey, buddy." Her voice was soft, gentle, as if speaking to a child who'd lost their way. She offered a bit of the grain she'd brought, holding it in her palm, but the colt only stared at her, unmoving. Sable gave a quiet nicker, as if encouraging him, but the colt pressed himself tighter to the earth. Riley's heart squeezed in sympathy. She checked him over carefully, her hands moving slow so as not to startle him. He was dehydrated, ribs like curved sticks beneath thin skin, his coat dulled to a coppery shadow. "He hasn't eaten in days," she murmured, glancing at Sable. The mare seemed to understand, gently nudging the colt, then nuzzling Riley's sleeve as if asking her to do something, anything. Riley fetched water from the stream, trickling it onto her fingers, offering them to the colt's lips. For a long moment, he just stared, his eyes glassy, his will to live nearly extinguished. Sable knelt beside him, her movements slow and deliberate, lowering herself until her flank pressed against his. Riley was stunned by the gesture. Such trust, such a willingness to share warmth, to shield another being from the cold world. It was patience, not pity, that finally made a difference. Riley stayed quiet, letting the soft sounds of her breathing and Sable's steady heartbeat fill the space. She talked in low tones about nothing in particular, about the way the sky changed color at sunrise, about the wild horses she'd once seen as a girl, about her father's favorite lullaby. Sable hummed and whickered, brushing her nose along the colt's mane. The hours stretched by. Riley tried offering grass, then more water. The colt ignored it all, lost somewhere inside himself. She felt her own exhaustion growing, frustration threatening to break through. Why wouldn't he even try? She thought of all the animals she'd seen give up after disaster. The blank stare, the refusal to move or eat. She knew the signs, and she knew how close he was to crossing that invisible line. But Sable wouldn't give up. Again and again, she nuzzled him, her breath warm and insistent. When the colt finally lifted his head, just for a second, Sable let out a soft nicker, encouraging him. Riley held her breath. The colt's mouth trembled, and then, miraculously, he licked a drop of water from her hand. It was barely anything, but it was a beginning. The relief was so sudden that tears filled Riley's eyes. She wiped them away quickly, not wanting to break the moment. "That's it, little guy. Just a sip. You're not alone." She offered more water, coaxing him a little at a time. Sable lay beside him the whole while, a living anchor. The sun climbed higher, burning through the mist, painting the valley in gold. Riley gathered handfuls of the sweetest grass, laying them close to the colt's mouth. At first he ignored them, but after watching Sable nibble a few blades, he sniffed at the pile, curiosity flickering in his eyes. When he finally took his first tentative bite, Riley let out a shaky laugh, all the fear and hope in her chest mingling together. It was slow going. Riley and Sable took turns encouraging him, Sable with her gentle nuzzles, Riley with her patience and gentle words. Sometimes the colt would eat a few bites, then lie back down, exhausted by the effort. But each small victory was enough to keep Riley going. She felt herself rooting for him, with a desperation she hadn't felt in years. By afternoon, the colt's eyes had lost some of their emptiness. He started to watch Sable, mirroring her movements as she shifted in the grass. When Sable stood to stretch, the colt tried to get up too, legs trembling under his weight. He collapsed the first time and the second, but Riley resisted the urge to help. He needed to do it on his own. The third time, with Sable standing over him like a guardian, the colt pushed himself upright. His knees wobbled, but he managed to stand, swaying in the breeze, sides heaving with effort. Riley let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Sable pressed her nose to his, a mother's blessing. "Brave boy," Riley whispered. The colt took a shaky step, then another, reaching Sable's side. He leaned into her, drawing strength from her presence, his head tucked under her chin. That night, Riley built up the shelter as best she could, using branches and the emergency blanket from her kit. She gathered more water, sharing what little food she had. Sable watched over the colt, keeping him warm. Riley wrote in her notebook by flashlight, "He wants to live." Sable gave him hope. The three of them huddled together as the night deepened, the valley quiet except for the sound of breathing and the soft rustle of grass. Riley knew it wasn't over. There would be more struggles ahead, more moments when hope would flicker. But for tonight, they had each other. In the darkness, the little colt stood, eating, because someone had waited, because someone had believed he could make it. The storm arrived just before noon, sweeping across the hills with a sudden, wild force that turned the morning's gold into bruised gray. Riley woke from a fitful doze, the cold already creeping under her skin. Her body ached from the rough night, but she barely noticed. Her eyes went straight to the colt and Sable. The colt, still shaky but standing, pressed close to Sable, searching for comfort. Sable was alert, her ears flicking toward every rumble of thunder. Riley looked up at the swirling sky, and felt a cold weight settle in her gut. "We have to move, girl," she whispered, already packing up her makeshift camp. "If we don't leave now, we'll be trapped out here." Lightning forked in the distance, thunder chasing after. Riley coaxed the colt closer, offering small handfuls of grain, her other hand steady on Sable's mane. The valley had turned slick and treacherous overnight. The grass was flattened by rain, and mud sucked at Riley's boots as she tried to lead them to higher ground. For the first time, Sable took the lead, stepping carefully but with purpose. The colt hesitated at the edge of a shallow creek, but Sable crossed first, then turned and nickered softly. Riley held her breath. The colt's legs shook, but he followed, water splashing up to his knees. When he reached Sable's side on the far bank, Riley felt a rush of relief so sharp it made her dizzy. The climb up the ridge was the hardest part. The wind howled through the trees, tearing at Riley's jacket and sending cold, stinging drops into her eyes. Branches whipped across her arms and face, but she kept going, Sable just ahead, the colt never more than a step away from her side. There was no time for doubt or fear. Riley's focus narrowed to the slippery path, to every tremble in the colt's legs, to Sable's steady presence guiding them onward. Halfway up, the sky cracked open with hail, hard as marbles, pelting horse and human alike. Riley hunched over the colt, shielding him as best she could with her body and arms. Sable positioned herself on the colt's other side, angling her body into the wind, bearing the brunt of the storm. For several long minutes, the three of them huddled together beneath the twisted limbs of a juniper, battered but unbroken. Riley's hands went numb, but she refused to let go. When the worst passed, Riley looked up at Sable, rain streaming down the mare's face. Their eyes met. Something passed between them, a shared vow that none of them would be left behind. Riley gathered her strength and rose, the colt wobbling but determined beside her. Step by muddy, freezing step, they pushed up the final switchback. At the crest, the sanctuary came into view at last. The red barn with its peeling paint, the weathered fence line. The small crowd gathered under the eaves, scanning the storm for signs of life. Someone spotted them, and a cry rang out. Riley's name, then Sable's, then a collective shout as the group saw the colt limping at Sable's flank. Riley felt the exhaustion crash into her all at once, but she kept moving, waving feebly to the volunteers as she led Sable and the colt through the gate. The sanctuary's usual calm was shattered as people rushed forward, voices jumbled, hands reaching to help. Marcia was first at her side, her eyes wide with shock and relief. "You did it. Oh my God, Riley, you really did it." Riley let herself sag into Marcia's hug, laughing through tears. The colt shivered against Sable, and Riley dropped to her knees, whispering, "You made it, little guy. You made it home." The volunteers gathered around, forming a protective barrier as the storm howled on. Sable shook herself, then nuzzled the colt, her body still shielding him from the wind. Inside the barn, Riley and Marcia got to work, drying off the colt with blankets, checking his legs for injury. Sable refused to leave his side, standing guard in the stall even as the thunder faded. Someone brought carrots and apples, and to everyone's astonishment, Sable took a piece from Riley's hand, crunching it loudly before dropping another for the colt. Outside, the sanctuary board watched the scene with a mixture of awe and shame. Atwood stood at the back, silent, arms folded as he took in the spectacle. Volunteers cheering, donors snapping photos, the local vet tearing up as she examined the colt. The story was already spreading. The mare who survived the fire, the the sanctuary worker who wouldn't give up, the orphan colt who owed his life to a horse's stubborn love. Later that afternoon, when the rain finally stopped, Riley found herself standing in the center of the barn aisle, staring at Sable and the colt, who, after much debate, was already being called brave by the youngest volunteers. Riley's hands trembled as she realized the miracle she'd witnessed. Not just one survivor returned, but two. A family formed out of ashes and storms. The board called an emergency meeting that evening, but the tone had changed. Atwood cleared his throat awkwardly as donors and neighbors filled the seats, their eyes shining with hope and pride. "There are times," he began, "when numbers on a page don't tell the whole story." He gestured to the barn, where Sable stood with Brave leaning against her. "Sometimes you just have to believe in what you see." Riley spoke up for the first time, her voice quiet but steady. "Sable isn't broken. She's a mother who came back for her heart. And Brave, he's proof that second chances matter. Not just for animals, but for all of us." Applause erupted. Not just polite, but wild, thunderous. Even some of the most skeptical board members found themselves smiling, blinking away tears. The sanctuary was alive again. Hope crackling through the air as new volunteers signed up on the spot. Donors reached for their checkbooks, and families promised to come back for every open day. That night, as dusk settled soft over the sanctuary, Riley visited the barn one last time. Sable and Brave were asleep in their stall, the colt curled close to her side. Riley leaned against the door, letting herself breathe deeply for the first time in days. For a while, she just stood there, letting the sounds of slow breathing and peaceful nickers fill her up. Marcia joined her, handing over a steaming mug of tea. "You saved them both, you know." Riley shook her head, smiling. "No, Marcia. Sable saved him. I just refused to leave." Outside, the stars poked through the last remnants of storm cloud. Inside, three hearts, woman, mare, and colt, rested safe and together. The world had turned, and hope had come home, riding out of the fire and the rain. The world changed after the storm, and so did Windsong Sanctuary. The story of the fire mare and the rescued colt spread far beyond the boundaries of their Colorado Valley. News crews showed up, capturing images of Sable standing guard over Brave, of Riley leading groups of curious children through the pastures. Social media lit up with pictures and messages from all over the country. Donations poured in, along with letters from people moved by Sable's resilience and the colt's recovery. Suddenly, Windsong was a place people wanted to believe in, a place where healing was more than a word. Yet for Riley, the biggest change wasn't what happened outside the sanctuary. It was what happened within her own heart. She stood each morning at the fence, watching the sunrise with Sable and Brave. The three of them, survivors in their own right, greeted the new day together in the hush before the sanctuary awoke. It became their silent ritual, Sable lifting her head to the east, Brave pressing close to her side, Riley's hand resting lightly on the mare's neck. Riley turned down the Denver job offer. She wrote a short, honest letter to the hiring committee, explaining that she'd found a different calling, a purpose that didn't fit in a paycheck or a job title. For the first time in years, she felt at peace with her decision. She no longer felt like she was running from something, but running toward something, toward hope, toward service, toward a kind of wholeness she'd thought was lost. With the new surge of interest and resources, Windsong was able to expand its programs. Riley pitched an idea to the board, a youth outreach initiative that brought foster kids and at-risk teens to the sanctuary. It was more than animal therapy. It was about teaching trust and patience, the same kind that Sable had taught her. The board, buoyed by their newfound support, approved the plan without hesitation. The first group of kids arrived on a crisp spring morning. Riley watched them step nervously off the bus, some laughing too loudly, others quiet and withdrawn. She recognized the look in their eyes. She'd seen it in the mirror and in Sable and Brave. Riley introduced them to the basics: how to approach a horse, how to listen with your whole body, how to offer a hand without demanding anything in return. Brave became the program's little star. At first, he was shy, sticking close to Sable. But as days went by, he grew bold, his curiosity returning. He would trot along the fence, letting the kids stroke his soft nose, nuzzling for treats. Sable watched closely, but no longer flinched at every approach. She accepted the gentle grooming, the soft brushes through her mane, the patient hands that lingered on her scars. One afternoon, Riley watched as a boy named Marcus, 10 years old, with dark hair and old sadness in his eyes, approached Sable, brush in hand. He moved slowly, just as Riley had taught, talking under his breath about nothing in particular. Sable remained still, letting him work through the tangles in her mane. "She's got scars," Marcus said quietly, running his hand along her side. "But she's not scared." Riley knelt beside him, her voice gentle. "Sometimes scars just mean you survived, and that you're stronger than what tried to hurt you." Marcus looked at her, a question in his eyes, then nodded and kept brushing. Word of the program spread, and soon there were waiting lists. Local agencies called, asking if their kids could come out for a day, a week, a summer. Riley trained new volunteers, teaching them the lessons Sable and Brave had taught her. That healing doesn't come from forcing or fixing, but from witnessing, from being present through the silence and storms. Riley was asked to speak at a regional animal welfare conference. Standing at the podium, she found herself trembling, not from fear, but from the enormity of what she wanted to share. When Sable first came to us, we tried everything to fix her. But it was only when we stopped trying to hurry her grief, when we sat with her in the quiet, that she began to heal. Patience isn't passive. It's the bravest thing you can give someone. It's saying, "I'm not going anywhere, no matter how long it takes." The crowd was silent, listening. Riley saw faces shining with tears, others nodding in recognition. Brave survived because Sable waited for him. Sable survived because someone waited for her. We all need that sometimes. Someone who doesn't ask us to move on, but who stands with us until we're ready. Afterward, people came up to her with stories of their own, of lost pets, lost family, lost parts of themselves. Riley realized how universal the lesson was, and how deeply it was needed. Patience, she told herself again and again, was what made healing possible. Back at Windsong, life found a new rhythm. The other horses began to accept Brave into the herd, and Sable, always the sentinel, watched from a short distance, letting go little by little. Riley spent more time with the kids, teaching them to read horses' body language, to listen for what wasn't said. She watched as trust grew, slow and sturdy, like wildflowers after a burn. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of pink and orange, Riley sat on the fence watching Sable and Brave grazing together in the long grass. She thought about how far they'd all come. From the fire, from the storm, from the edge of giving up. She thought about the patience it took to wait through pain, the courage to reach out again after being hurt. Sable and Brave had become symbols of recovery, not just for the sanctuary, but for everyone who came through its gates. Their story reminded people that even in the face of overwhelming loss, healing was possible, not by forgetting, but by carrying grief forward into new love and purpose. Riley smiled, feeling hope bloom inside her chest, steady and warm. Sometimes, she realized, the greatest gift you could give was simply to stay. There are moments in every journey when time seems to slow, as if the universe itself wants you to pause and notice the meaning hidden in the day-to-day details. For Riley, the days after the rescue settled into a new kind of quiet, a gentle, lasting peace that was different from the silence of grief. It was the hush that follows a storm, the breath before the dawn, the space where healing finally takes root. The sanctuary, once a place of struggle and uncertainty, thrived in the wake of Sable and Brave's story. The donations continued to flow, but what mattered most was the spirit of hope that lingered over Windsong like the sweet smell of clover in spring. Riley found herself waking before the sun, not out of anxiety, but anticipation. She looked forward to the sunrise ritual, when Sable and Brave, now inseparable, greeted the morning as if each new day was a promise. The scars on Sable's flank faded but never vanished. Brave grew quickly, shedding the hollow look of a lost foal and replacing it with a spark that delighted every visitor. He became the sanctuary's gentle ambassador, the first to greet new arrivals, whether horses or humans, with a nudge of his nose or a playful kick of his heels. Sable kept a careful watch over him, but she too relaxed into the herd, her vigilance slowly melting into a calm confidence. Riley's program flourished. Kids from every corner of the county, some with tough exteriors, some fragile and shy, found something at Windsong that they couldn't find anywhere else. Patience, acceptance, and the quiet knowledge that even the deepest wounds could heal. Riley worked alongside them, teaching not just about horses, but about resilience. She explained that scars were not things to hide, but marks of survival, of having made it through something difficult and still finding reasons to hope. Some days, Riley still felt the tug of old sorrow. She remembered the fire, the panic, the helplessness she'd felt watching her father slip away years ago. But she no longer carried the guilt like an anchor. Instead, it was a weight she'd learned to hold, to set down and pick up as needed. A reminder that grief was not the end of her story, but the beginning of something new. Sable, too, did not forget her foal. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, she would stand at the far end of the pasture, her gaze turned toward the pond she had always avoided. Riley would watch her from a distance, understanding that some pain is never fully left behind. But Sable always returned, always to Brave, to the safety of the herd, to the gentle touch of the children she had once feared. She carried her grief forward, transforming it into tenderness, into patience, into the fierce love she showed the colt and those who needed her most. As for Brave, he never knew the world before the fire, never knew the fear of being left behind. What he learned from the very beginning was that love could find you even in your darkest hour, that someone would wait for you until you were ready to try again. His trust in the world was fragile at first, but day by day it strengthened, rooted in the steadfast presence of Riley and Sable. One evening, as summer gave way to fall, the sanctuary hosted an open house. Families wandered the grounds, children giggling as they learned to groom ponies, teenagers listening to Riley's gentle encouragement as they led their first horses across the paddock. Sable and Brave stood at the center of it all, calm and radiant, letting the hands of strangers brush over their coats, letting new voices fill the barn with laughter and possibility. At dusk, as the crowd drifted home and the sky blushed pink over the mountains, Riley gathered the volunteers for a final circle in the pasture. She looked at the faces around her. Marcia, who'd never stopped believing in second chances. Atwood, who now grinned sheepishly, humbled by the lessons he'd learned. The new generation of kids who saw themselves in the horses and found courage in that reflection. Riley spoke quietly, her words carried by the breeze. We all carry something, some loss, some pain, but we are not meant to carry it alone. Sable didn't forget her foal. She found a way to carry that love forward. Brave didn't need to be fixed. He just needed someone to wait, to believe he could stand. I didn't run from the fire. I walked back into it. And in doing so, I found that staying is sometimes the bravest thing we can do. She paused, letting the truth settle in the golden twilight. Healing isn't about forgetting. It's about making space for what hurts and letting it become part of our story. Not the end, but the beginning of something bigger. The volunteers listened, some with tears in their eyes, some with gentle smiles. Sable nudged Brave, who responded with a playful leap, the two of them a living reminder that even in the aftermath of devastation, life can find a way. Riley closed with a question, her voice soft but steady. When was the last time you gave someone, or yourself, the time and patience to heal without rushing them? Sometimes that's the greatest gift we can offer. Sometimes it's the only thing that truly matters. As night settled over Windsong, the sanctuary grew quiet again. The horses grazed beneath the stars. The children lingered, reluctant to leave the peace they'd found. Riley stood with Sable and Brave, her heart full, not just of memory, but of possibility. The story of the mare who waded through fire, the colt who learned to live, and the woman who refused to give up was not just a tale for children or for those who loved horses. It was a lesson for everyone, that grief is not the end of the story. It is, in its own way, a beginning.